Okay, we're doing some quotes from the book Holy Grail of Wisdom Quotes by me, P. Rogers. We're doing George Carlin today, the comedian, and Thomas Carlyle, the Englishman. So, English Scotsman. Okay, so George Carlin lived from 1937 to 2008. His first quote, I'm an alpha male on beta blockers. Don't teach your children to read. Teach them to question what they read. That's good advice. The people who run the world, they don't want well-informed, well-educated people capable of critical thinking. They want obedient workers. They want people who are just smart enough to run the machines and do the paperwork. And I would say, like in medicine, they want a doctor who's smart enough to crank out billing codes as fast as possible. They don't want a doctor who actually thinks about the disease and figures out how to cure the patient. That would be a disaster. You cure a patient, you lose a customer. Okay, George Carlin continues. The upper class keeps all the money, pays none of the taxes. The middle class pays all the taxes and does all the work. The poor are there to scare the middle class. And that's a very common thing. A political demagogue stirs up the poor to make them hate the middle class. And the society goes down the tube. It sounds like most of the West these days. Okay, George Carlin. Have you ever noticed that the person who drives slower than you is always an idiot, and the person who drives faster than you is always a maniac? Okay, so George Carlin, he can be pretty funny, pretty clever sometimes. He's also kind of a cynical jerk in a lot of other situations, but he is clever and funny. Okay, now we're going to do Thomas Carlyle. Thomas Carlyle lived from we're going in alphabetical order, of course. Thomas Carlyle lived from 1795 to 1881, born in Scotland, but lived his life largely in England, so especially in the Victorian age. He was brought up with Scottish Calvinism. His father was a stone laborer, and so he had sympathy for laborers. His father didn't make enough money to send him to get educated. He was initially trained in the clergy, but then he broke away from that. He identified with the poor laborers. He was a big proponent of the idea of the Protestant work ethic and that Protestants were better than other Christians. He was friends with the philosopher John Stuart Mill, who wrote On Liberty, about liberty for Englishmen, but he didn't care about it for the Irish or for the people of India. With John Ruskin, the great art critic, crazy genius, Tennyson, the poet, Charles Dickens, the great novelist. Carlyle felt that non-Protestants were lazy, and that led them to live in squalor compared to Protestants. Carlyle's books sold very well during his life. He did not get along well with his wife. She had a real hot temper, and so they were bickering constantly. People noted that about them. Carlyle was good at mathematics, taught math early. Then he was an expert in German. He translated books from German to English. He was especially a big fan of Schiller. And then the thing that really launched his fame was when he wrote The History of the French Revolution. Charles Dickens loved his book, and Charles Dickens used it as his main historical source for writing A Tale of Two Cities, which is one of the top 10 novels of all time. Okay, here's some quotes from Thomas Carlyle. What we become depends on what we read after the professors have finished with us. Yeah, basically, most people forget almost everything they learned in high school, grade school and high school. And then from college, they usually remember best things that they wanted to study rather than what they had to study for their major, so to speak. And then what you read on your own because you want to learn it, that sticks with you much better than anything else. Okay, so Thomas Carlyle continues. The majority of people who have done anything great with their lives have passed their youth in seclusion. So what that's about is if you study geniuses, you'll often see that they went through a phase in their youth, let's say before 20, 22 years of age, where they were all by themselves for a prolonged amount of time. Like Isaac Newton, his mother basically abandoned him when she ran off with another man after his father died. Okay, Schopenhauer spent a tremendous amount of time alone. His father died relatively young, and his mother kind of hated him. Okay, so he was alone a lot. Talleyrand had a clubfoot, so he couldn't be, he couldn't inherit his parents' wealth, so he got sent to the clergy, and he just sat around in the library reading and studying. I went through a phase when I went out to Stanford for my athletic scholarship. I didn't know anybody there, and I was so lonely. It was very painful. 4 years at Stanford, I never had a girlfriend at Stanford. Whereas all my buddies that went to state schools, wrestlers and athletes, they would tell me all kinds of stories about going to the bars 5-6 nights a week and having all these girlfriends. Okay, Carlyle continues. A person with purpose will make progress even on the roughest road. A person with no purpose will make no progress even on the smoothest road. Perseverance in spite of all obstacles, discouragements, impossibilities. It is this that in all things distinguishes the strong soul from the weak. All great people are conservative. Okay, I would probably agree with most of that. Okay, but what I'm saying is you have to have an inner drive. Like, I really admired Pirsig, He wrote Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. He was working full time. And what he would do is he would go to bed early. He'd wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning. Then he would write until he had to go to work in the morning. And that's how he did it. And that's when I realized too, gee, I got all these books in my head floating around that I want to write, but I'm just too busy working as a conventional doctor. So I started figuring out ways, how could I do this? I could constantly be reading a book in the car, listening to an audiobook. I could constantly read a book in the bathroom with the magic bathroom concept. I could constantly be taking notes, always carry around a note card and write down my ideas whenever I had an idea, whenever I learned something, and then consolidate it by keeping a file of that information on a computer. And so I just kept on doing a little bit each day, and pretty soon, boom, crank out a book, boom, crank out a book, boom, crank out a book. And that made me happy. And you also have to persevere in the face of adversity because you know you're right. Because sadly, if you're a great athlete, you make a lot of money and people like you. But when you're a great scholar, the more you try to change the conventional way of doing things, the more people hate you. You get hatred, you get shadow banned, you get in trouble. And so you just have to believe it's right to do it because quite often the best ideas, the best material, they don't bring you fame and acclaim. They get you persecuted. Okay, you be a bullshitter, lie to the pros, trick the pros. You get money, you get views, etc. You do good things and you get shadow, banned. Okay. Thomas Carlyle continues. The true university of these days is a collection of books. A man without a purpose is like a ship without a rudder. Biography is the most universally pleasant and profitable of all reading. The history of the world is the biography of great men. It's kind of hard for women to do much intellectually in the past because they're so busy being pregnant and nursing. Back in the Victorian age, in the 1800s, a woman would typically have 10 pregnancies. She'd have, 10 kids, 10 live-born kids. Some of the kids would die, but 10 live-born kids typically, and she would nurse them for about 2-3 years. So she spent most of her time being either pregnant or nursing a baby. Nowadays, with birth control pills, she can control her reproduction, and she's got more time to do other things. Thomas Carlyle continues. Tell a person that they are brave and you will help them to become so. It's a little bit like the Goethe quote, but there's a lot of truth in it. You give people encouragement and they try harder. A loving heart is the beginning of knowledge. I like that quote, and that kind of goes with the whole beginning of wisdom stuff. So a loving heart is the beginning of knowledge. Yeah, a lot of people who are nice, but they don't know anything other than being nice, they're still very valuable and you want them around, versus a lot of people who are smart and educated, but they're nasty. All they do is cause trouble. You don't want them around. Carlyle continues. Genius is an infinite capacity for taking pains. Yeah, anybody who makes a great artistic achievement, like Michelangelo, for example, he said, no one would admire my skill so much if they realize how hard I have to work. Okay. All right, the next one, Thomas Carlyle. If a book comes from the heart, it will reach other hearts. And I think there's truth in that, in the sense that what you're most afraid to write, what you feel like, should I even say this in public, that's the stuff that people actually enjoy. It's a little bit embarrassing for me to talk about my divorce, the moving photos from my divorce, but it resonates with people because they know that pain, that suffering, that's true, okay? And I had learned that too from watching other artists and writers. Dostoevsky wrote about the problems in his life, okay? Eminem, even though he's a jerk and a scumbag, his best songs are when he sings about real things in his life, the situation with his daughter, with his wife. Let's see. Carlyle continues. The school of experience takes high wages, but it teaches like no other. The past is always attractive because it is drained of fear. Yeah, it's a lot of fun to daydream about the past. If only I had done this different, things would have worked out with this girl. If only I had done this different, I would have won that match and become an All-American in wrestling, and I'm sad about that. But then when you think about the future, it's not as much fun to think about the future because you got all these obstacles you got to figure out how to negotiate. But still, the future is more useful to think about the future because that's what you got to deal with. Carlyle continues. All that mankind has done, thought, gained, or been, it is lying in magic preservation in the pages of books. They are the chosen possession of man. Carlyle continues. Show me the man you honor, and I will know what kind of man you are. Okay, that's one of the quotes. Like I said, the reason I like all those pictures of people who I admire in my magic bathroom, there are pictures on the wall, is because they motivate me. And, like Roan had said, you're like the people you spend the most time around with. So make sure you're spending time around people that motivate you, inspire you, put good thoughts into your brain, energize you. Carlyle continues. The best effect of any book is that it excites the reader to self-activity. have a purpose in life, and having it throw yourself into your work with such strength of mind and muscle as God has given you. Yeah. Look at your life. What are your options? Pick the best one and go with it. And then you'll be better off. Like we said too, the Graham Weaver quote. You're going to have inevitable suffering and pain, so you might as well make it worth it. And you make it worth it by doing something good with the part of your life that you can control. Carlyle continues, a person usually has two reasons for doing something, a good reason and the real reason. That's my favorite Carlyle quote. I remember this one all the time because a lot of times people say something to you and it comes at you and they're saying something that sounds reasonable. But you look closely at it, it's not true. The real reason they're saying you that is they're trying to make a chump out of you. They're trying to sell you something. They're trying to lie to you. They're trying to trick you. That happens very often. And so you got to be careful to analyze that reason. Is that really why they're saying this? Is that really why they're doing this? Okay, histories are distilled newspapers. The man without a purpose is like a ship without a rudder. No pressure, no diamonds. The secret of business is to know something that no one else knows. Okay, so that was quotes by Thomas Carlyle, and before that we did George Carlin in this video. Hope that was helpful.